The quiet morning that changed everything. It was a peaceful Thursday morning in Crescentville, a small suburban town nestled amidst rolling hills, where the streets were always clean, the lawns neatly trimmed, and the air imbued with the scent of freshly baked bread. Franklin Morris, the former U.S. Attorney General, was a familiar figure in the community, a man who believed that the key to aging well wasn't just about a healthy diet or avoiding bad habits, but in staying active and engaged in life. He had made it his daily habit to jog through the quiet streets of Crescentville, using the peaceful surroundings as a way to keep his mind sharp and his body in motion. At the age of 68, Franklin had seen and experienced much in his lifetime. Decades of service in the legal system, countless victories and defeats, and a lifetime spent advocating for justice and fairness. But his morning jogs, though simple, were perhaps his favorite time of day. They gave him a moment of peace, a moment to reflect and recharge before starting another day of work in his small private practice. Franklin was the embodiment of discipline, but also of wisdom, and he knew well that wisdom didn't come from simply growing older. It came from growing through challenges, learning from experience, and always remaining open to new lessons life had to offer. That Thursday morning, however, Franklin's routine would be interrupted by something he could never have anticipated. As he jogged past the old bakery on Elm Street, his feet tapping the pavement in rhythmic sync with his thoughts, he heard something unusual. A faint sound, muffled but unmistakable, reached his ears. At first, he thought it was the wind or maybe the sound of a car backfiring. But then the sound came again. This time, sharper and more desperate. It was a cry. Franklin's pace slowed, his curiosity piqued. He turned his head toward the narrow alleyway, just beside the bakery, where shadows lingered even in the daylight. His instincts, honed by years of dealing with the complexities of the law and human nature, kicked in. He knew that voice wasn't the wind. It was the sound of someone in need. Without a second thought, Franklin veered off the main street and walked toward the alley. As he rounded the corner, his eyes immediately focused on a woman, a frail, elderly woman who was struggling with two young men. One of them was gripping her purse, trying to yank it from her hand, while the other was twisting her wrist, attempting to remove a bracelet from her arm. The scene unfolded in front of him in slow motion. Franklin's heart pounded as the woman's cries filled the air. The young men were aggressive, their eyes hard and focused solely on their prize. Franklin felt a surge of anger rise within him, but he knew that his first reaction had to be measured. This was no longer about law or rights. It was about humanity. This woman needed help. "Hey, leave her alone," Franklin shouted, his voice commanding, though tinged with the frustration of witnessing such injustice. The two young men froze, their eyes flicking over to Franklin. They quickly sized him up. An older man, dressed in jogging clothes, probably not much of a threat, they thought. But Franklin wasn't about to back down. His voice was firm as he took a step closer, his fists instinctively clenching, ready to defend. For a brief moment, there was a standoff. The young men exchanged a glance, their decision quickly made. They dropped their hold on the woman and bolted, darting into the alley's shadows before disappearing entirely. Franklin stood still, watching them retreat. He debated for a moment whether to chase them, but his age and the reality of the situation held him back. This wasn't about running down criminals. It was about ensuring the woman was okay. He turned to her, his voice softening. "Are you all right?" he asked, his tone full of concern. The woman, trembling, looked up at him, her hands clutching the empty strap of her purse. She was visibly shaken, tears welling in her eyes, as she tried to compose herself. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "They took everything I had." Franklin nodded sympathetically, but before he could say another word, the screech of tires broke the silence. A police car slammed to a halt at the end of the alley, its engine still humming as the officer inside leaped out. The officer's hand was already on his gun, his eyes scanning the scene with a mix of urgency and suspicion. "Step away from her," the officer barked, his voice sharp and commanding. Franklin, taken aback, froze. "I was just helping her," he explained, confusion flooding his mind. He took a step back instinctively, but the officer's stance didn't change. Instead, the officer's eyes narrowed in suspicion, and he raised his gun slightly, still keeping it trained on Franklin. "Step away now," the officer repeated, his voice laced with authority, ignoring the elderly woman's protests. Franklin felt the tension building in his chest. He could feel the eyes of the growing crowd around them, the murmurs of confusion and curiosity. This wasn't how he envisioned the situation unfolding. He had been trying to help, yet here he was, being treated as the potential threat. "Wait, officer," Franklin said, his voice steady though the anger was beginning to simmer just beneath the surface. "There's been a misunderstanding. I was trying to help her, not harm her." The officer's response was to scoff, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Trying to help, huh? You look more like you're trying to get away, old man." Franklin's jaw tightened. He had seen this before, disrespect born out of assumptions. He had dealt with all manner of criminals, but it was moments like this that tested his patience. The officer's hand hovered near his gun, a subtle but real threat. Franklin knew he had to act carefully. If he made the wrong move now, things could escalate in a heartbeat. Slowly, he reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing the smooth surface of his identification. "Don't move," the officer shouted, his voice rising with tension. Franklin's hand paused mid-motion, his mind working quickly to avoid provoking the officer any further. He knew this moment could be pivotal, and he didn't want to make it worse. He could see the officer's eyes flicking to his holster, the gun's handle barely visible as the officer's grip tightened. "I'm just getting my ID," Franklin said calmly, his voice carrying the weight of authority that had come from years of experience. But the officer wasn't listening, his eyes fixed on Franklin as though he were the one in the wrong. "Don't try anything stupid," the officer warned, his voice low and tense. Franklin took a deep breath, his hands remaining steady as he pulled out his badge. He held it up slowly, so the officer could see it clearly. "Take a good look, officer," Franklin said, his voice firm but without aggression. "I'm Franklin Morris, former U.S. Attorney General." For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The officer's gaze flicked back and forth between Franklin's face and the gleaming gold emblem in his hand. Then it clicked. The officer's face drained of color as the realization hit him. He had just pointed his gun at someone far more important than he had assumed. His grip on the weapon faltered, and the gun lowered slightly. "I didn't know," the officer stammered, his voice full of disbelief. "No," Franklin replied, his tone cool but cutting. "You didn't, because you didn't ask." The crowd that had gathered around them whispered in stunned disbelief. The elderly woman, who had been cowering behind Franklin just moments earlier, stepped forward. Her voice, once fragile and uncertain, now had strength. "He's telling the truth," she said, her words filled with gratitude. "He saved me. He helped me." The officer's face turned a shade paler, and he stammered another apology. But it was too late. The damage had been done. Pointing a gun at an innocent man, a former U.S. Attorney General, no less, wasn't something that could be brushed off. Franklin had spent years ensuring that justice was upheld in all corners of society, and now it seemed that he had to stand up for it once again, in this very alley. "Pointing a gun at someone without understanding the situation is no mistake, officer," Franklin said sharply, his voice unwavering. "It's a serious violation of protocol." Within minutes, Officer Jack Burnett was escorted away by his superiors, his future uncertain. The crowd, which had once murmured in confusion, now fell into a heavy silence, some offering Franklin looks of admiration and others simply staring at the officer's retreating form. Franklin turned to the elderly woman, his expression softening. He smiled gently. "Are you okay now?" he asked. The woman, still shaken but grateful, nodded. "I'm better now, Thanks to you, she whispered. Franklin's heart swelled with a quiet pride. It wasn't the confrontation, nor the badge, that mattered most. It was that, in a world that often rushed past, he had taken the time to care. The weight of justice. As Franklin watched Officer Barnett walk away under the watchful eyes of his superiors, he felt a strange mix of relief and unease settle over him. The crowd began to disperse slowly, their murmurs fading into the morning air, but Franklin stayed rooted in place. He glanced at the elderly woman, who was still clinging to what little was left of her dignity after the harrowing experience. The look in her eyes was one of deep gratitude, but there was also a sadness there, a quiet realization of how fragile the safety she once took for granted had become. "Do you need me to take you somewhere?" Franklin asked, his voice gentle but steady. He knew she was shaken, but he could sense there was something more weighing on her heart. She hadn't just lost her purse, she had lost her sense of security, the very thing that allowed her to live freely in her own neighborhood. The woman shook her head, wiping away the last of her tears with the back of her hand. "I don't know," she murmured, her voice small. "I'm just so tired, Franklin. Tired of feeling afraid. Tired of seeing the world change in ways I can't keep up with." Franklin nodded, understanding more than she realized. He had been watching the world change for decades, and not all of those changes were for the better. He could feel the growing divide between people, the anger, the mistrust, the divisions that seemed to widen every day. In his time as Attorney General, he had seen the best of people, but he had also seen the worst. He had witnessed both the triumphs and the failures of justice, the moments when the law prevailed and the moments when it faltered. But it wasn't just the law that had failed this woman. It was the erosion of the fundamental sense of decency that once bound communities together, the feeling that neighbors cared for one another, that you could walk down the street without looking over your shoulder. Franklin knew that those values, once universal, were slipping away, replaced by fear and suspicion. "I know it's hard," Franklin said, his voice filled with an unexpected depth of empathy. "But this doesn't mean we give up. If anything, it means we double down on the values that matter most. Justice, respect, compassion. It's easy to let fear control us, but we can't let it define us." The woman looked up at him, her eyes still clouded with doubt. "I don't know, Franklin. The world feels different now. People don't look out for each other like they used to. And when you try to help, it seems like you're only making things worse." Franklin paused for a moment, letting her words sink in. He understood her sentiment all too well. The world had indeed changed, and not always for the better. But he wasn't ready to give up on it. Not yet. "You're right," he said finally, his tone calm yet resolute. "The world has changed. But that doesn't mean we can't change it back. One person at a time, one act of kindness at a time. You can't change the whole world in a day, but you can change the world of someone in need. That's a start." The woman's eyes softened as she listened to Franklin's words. There was something about his calm demeanor and unwavering belief that spoke to her heart. It was as if, in that moment, he had given her permission to believe again, that the world was still capable of goodness, even if it was hidden beneath layers of chaos and confusion. "I suppose that's true," she said slowly, her voice still tinged with uncertainty, but with a spark of hope beginning to shine through. "Maybe if we all did a little more, helped each other a little more, maybe things wouldn't feel so out of control." Franklin nodded. "Exactly. It's not about grand gestures or fighting every battle. It's about showing up. It's about doing what's right, even when no one is looking. If enough of us do that, eventually it will start to make a difference." The elderly woman took a deep breath, as if she were finally finding some semblance of peace amid the turmoil. "I used to think I didn't have much to offer," she said, her voice growing steadier. "But I think maybe I do. Maybe I can still make a difference, no matter how small." Franklin smiled, a warm, reassuring smile that reached his eyes. "You've already made a difference today," he said, "by simply being here, By standing up for yourself. That's where it all begins. Every act of courage, no matter how small, builds a foundation for something better. The woman nodded, and for the first time since the ordeal began, she stood a little taller. She didn't look as fragile as before. There was a strength in her that had been awakened, and though the road ahead would still be challenging, she now had the resolve to face it. "I'll be all right," she said softly, more to herself than to Franklin. "I won't let fear keep me from living my life. I'll fight for the safety and peace I deserve." Franklin patted her gently on the shoulder. "You're not alone in that fight. We all have a part to play in this world. And sometimes, it's the quietest acts of courage that make the loudest impact." As they spoke, Franklin couldn't help but think about the larger picture. The world was full of people who felt powerless, who didn't believe their voices mattered, who were weighed down by the chaos of society. But he knew something the rest of them didn't. Power wasn't something that came from holding a position of authority. It wasn't something that came from wealth, status, or title. Power came from within. It came from the willingness to stand up for what was right, even when the odds were stacked against you. The power to make a difference wasn't reserved for politicians or high-ranking officials. It was the quiet power of the everyday person, the one who chose to do the right thing when no one was watching. It was the power of the neighbor who helps you carry your groceries, the teacher who stays after class to help a struggling student, the friend who listens when you need to talk. Franklin had spent his entire life navigating the world of high-profile cases and courtroom battles, but it was moments like these, moments of raw humanity and simple kindness, that truly shaped his understanding of justice. As he watched the woman begin to walk away, her steps a little more confident, Franklin felt a sense of peace settle over him. He had done his part today, and so had she. They had both faced a challenge, and together they had found a way to rise above it. But as Franklin turned to leave, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that this wasn't the end. It couldn't be. His work wasn't finished. If anything, it had just begun. In the chaos of the world, there were still countless acts of injustice, moments where people needed someone to stand up for them. And though he may no longer wear the title of U.S. Attorney General, Franklin knew his role in the world was far from over. As he jogged back toward his home, the sun now fully risen and casting a warm golden hue over Crescentville, Franklin thought about the path ahead. It wasn't always going to be easy, but it was always going to be worth it, and he would keep fighting for a world where kindness, justice, and integrity weren't just ideals, but everyday realities. The fight for a better tomorrow started with one step, and Franklin Morris had already taken his. The ripple effect of one action. The following days after the encounter in Crescentville's alley left Franklin with a sense of purpose he hadn't experienced in years. He returned to his regular routine of jogging through the town's streets, but this time his eyes were sharper, his mind more attuned to the underlying currents of life that often went unnoticed. The peaceful town he had once viewed as a refuge now seemed more complex, layered with silent stories, unspoken challenges, and moments of vulnerability hidden just beneath the surface. Franklin couldn't stop thinking about the elderly woman. Her face, once filled with fear and uncertainty, had gradually transformed into one of quiet resolve. He had witnessed the shift in her spirit, the way she had reclaimed her strength and dignity in the moments after their brief interaction. Her willingness to rise above fear and claim her agency had sparked something in him as well, a realization that justice wasn't merely the absence of crime, but the presence of active care, empathy, and community. As days turned into weeks, Franklin's thoughts would occasionally drift to the events that had unfolded. The memory of Officer Burnett's gun drawn, the sharp tension in the air, and the realization that a simple misunderstanding had nearly escalated into something far more dangerous. But it wasn't the officer's actions that stayed with him. It was the truth that had emerged in that alley. One simple act of standing up for what was right had set off a ripple effect that carried far beyond that moment. It was in those quiet, everyday moments that Franklin saw the true measure of a community. He had always known that justice wasn't confined to courtrooms, laws, or politicians. It was found in the choices people made every day, in how they treated one another, and in the willingness to speak out when something was wrong. And that, Franklin believed, was something that everyone could contribute to, even in small ways. His thoughts returned to the elderly woman, Mrs. Thompson, as he sat at his desk one afternoon. It had been a week since the incident, and the town had largely moved on, but Franklin couldn't shake the feeling that something important had shifted, not just for her, but for the community as a whole. Mrs. Thompson had become something of a local hero, not because she had taken down two would-be criminals, but because she had refused to let fear dictate her life. Word of her strength had spread through Crescentville like wildfire. People admired her resilience, her ability to stand firm in the face of adversity. Franklin had taken it upon himself to visit her the day after the encounter. When he arrived at her small, modest home, he found her sitting by the window, gazing out at the garden she had tended to for years. There was a quiet peace about her now, one that had not been there the day she had first encountered the thieves. "I've been thinking," Franklin began, his voice gentle, as he took a seat beside her. "You've inspired a lot of people, Mrs. Thompson. Your strength and courage haven't gone unnoticed." She smiled, but there was a hint of sadness in her eyes. "It's not about the attention, Franklin. It's about knowing that I can still make a difference. At my age, you start to wonder if anyone cares anymore, if you're still capable of doing something that matters." Franklin studied her for a moment, taking in her words. "You've done more than you know. Your actions spoke volumes, not just for you, but for all of us. You've reminded us that we're all capable of more than we think." Mrs. Thompson turned to face him, her expression soft but firm. "Maybe, but you know, Franklin, it's easy to forget that sometimes. Life can wear you down, and it's hard to remember your worth when it feels like the world is moving faster than you can keep up with. People forget to notice the small things, like kindness, like caring for one another." Franklin nodded thoughtfully. "You're right. We get so caught up in the big picture that we forget how powerful the small moments are. But those moments are the ones that truly shape the world. If we all took the time to notice the little acts of goodness around us, maybe we could start making a bigger difference." As he left Mrs. Thompson's home that afternoon, Franklin realized that her words had struck a chord deep within him. The ripple effect she had started was more than just a one-time incident. It was the beginning of something larger, a wave of change that could spread across the community if only people were willing to embrace it. Her courage had ignited something in others, a reminder that justice was not something confined to distant legal systems or political figures. It was something that lived in every individual. That evening, Franklin made a decision. He would begin to host weekly community gatherings in Crescentville. They would be informal, simple events, discussions on the challenges the town faced, the ways they could help each other, and the power of coming together as a collective force for good. His idea was met with some skepticism at first, but over time, more and more people began to show up, drawn by the opportunity to contribute to something greater than themselves. The first meeting was small, just a handful of people, sitting in folding chairs under the shade of the town's central oak tree. Franklin spoke briefly, but his words resonated deeply. He shared the story of that Thursday morning, the woman in the alley, the officer's mistake, and how a single act of kindness had sparked a series of events that would ripple through the town. But it wasn't just the incident itself that mattered. It was the willingness of people to stand up, to be present, and to act when they saw injustice, no matter how small. "Justice doesn't have to be grand," Franklin said, his voice calm but filled with conviction. "It's the everyday moments where we choose to do what's right that build the foundation for a better world. And each one of you has the power to make that choice." The crowd fell silent for a moment. And then, slowly, people began to speak. A local baker shared how she had been offering free bread to elderly residents who couldn't get out to the store. A schoolteacher spoke about the after-school programs she had started to help struggling students. A young mother talked about the ways in which neighbors had come together to help each other during difficult times, whether it was watching one another's children or helping with home repairs. Franklin listened, his heart swelling with pride. It wasn't the grand gestures that mattered most. It was the small acts of kindness, the moments when people chose to make the world a better place, one decision at a time. These were the moments that changed lives, that built communities, and that fostered a sense of justice far beyond the walls of any courtroom. As the weeks passed, the meetings grew. People began to volunteer more of their time, to help one another in ways that were meaningful and lasting. What had started as a small gathering in the park blossomed into a full-fledged movement within Crescentville. People were beginning to see that justice wasn't something that could only be fought in the courts or on the streets. It was something that had to be lived every day, in every action. But Franklin knew that even though things were changing, they still had a long way to go. He continued to meet with the townspeople, offering support and guidance when needed, but more often than not, he simply listened. He knew that sometimes, the most powerful thing you could do was to hear someone's story, to acknowledge their struggles, and to offer the comfort of knowing they weren't alone. As the town transformed, Franklin found himself more content than he had ever been. The quiet mornings, the jogs through Crescentville's peaceful streets, had become something much more than just a routine. They had become a symbol of the larger change that was happening in the world around him. And Franklin knew, deep in his heart, that he had played a small part in igniting that change. But more than that, he had reminded others of their power, of their ability to affect the world in ways they may never even see. The ripple effect of one action, one simple decision to stand up, to act with integrity, to choose kindness, had become something beautiful. And as the sun set over Crescentville, Franklin knew that the work was far from over. But for the first time in years, he felt a deep sense of peace, because in the end, it wasn't about fighting the world. It was about showing the world that together, we could make a difference, one small act at a time. The lasting legacy of a single act. Months passed, and the ripple that Franklin had set in motion continued to grow. Crescentville was no longer just a quiet, suburban town. It had become a model of what a community could achieve when its members cared for one another, when they chose to stand up and act with compassion, justice, and integrity. The once fragmented and disconnected fabric of the town had now been woven back together through countless small but powerful acts of kindness and collective effort. Franklin continued his morning jogs, now more of a symbolic gesture than a routine. Each run through Crescentville reminded him of the transformation he had witnessed, not just in the town, but in himself. He had once believed that true change could only be achieved through monumental shifts, through high-level decisions made in courtrooms and legislative chambers. But as he had come to realize, the real power for change resided in the hearts of ordinary people. One afternoon, as Franklin sat on his porch with a cup of coffee, watching the children of Crescentville play in the park across the street, he thought back to that fateful morning in the alley, the day that had started like any other, but had changed the course of his life. He had gone into that alley with the intention of helping someone, but he had walked away with so much more. His actions had sparked a transformation, but it was the people of Crescentville who had carried that spark forward. They had proven that no act of kindness, no matter how small, was ever wasted. The elderly woman, Mrs. Thompson, had become a symbol of resilience, showing others that no matter their age, they still had the power to make a difference. Officer Burnett, despite his initial mistake, had learned a valuable lesson in humility and the importance of questioning assumptions. And Franklin, though he had initially seen himself as a leader in the legal world, had found that true leadership was about empowering others to rise up and find their own strength. The story of that morning became a legend of sorts in Crescentville, not because of the drama of the moment, but because of the lesson it imparted. That justice is not something that is done to us, but something we must actively create every single day. It was in the small, unnoticed acts that real change took root, the moments when we choose to look out for one another, to be brave in the face of adversity, to speak up when something feels wrong, and to treat others with dignity and respect. The ripple effect continued, and the town began to experience a profound shift in the way people interacted with each other. It wasn't just the big acts of kindness that mattered. It was the smaller, everyday gestures that built the foundation of a caring community. A neighbor helped an elderly woman carry groceries. A teacher stayed late after class to give extra help to struggling students. A young father spent his Saturday helping a friend repair his fence. These were the moments that truly made a difference. One day, while Franklin was sitting in his office, he received a letter. It was from Mrs. Thompson. She thanked him for his role in helping her that day in the alley. But more than that, she thanked him for showing her that she wasn't invisible, that her voice mattered, and that it was never too late to stand up for what was right. She shared that her life had changed in the months since that encounter. She had started volunteering at the local food pantry, offering her time to help those in need. She had reconnected with old friends, started participating in community events, and even inspired others to get involved. She had found her voice again, and it was clear that the town had been just as changed by her as she had been by them. Franklin smiled as he read the letter, feeling a warmth spread through him. He knew that change had to start with one person, but it was only through the collective action of many that it would sustain itself. The work was far from over, but the town of Crescentville was on its way to something better. As Franklin stood up and gazed out of his office window, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of peace. He had seen firsthand how one person's courage, one simple act of standing up for what was right, could create a wave of change that impacted an entire community. The fear and doubt that had once plagued him had given way to hope, a hope that was now alive in every corner of Crescentville. The story of that Thursday morning, though simple, was a powerful reminder that justice was not a distant concept or something confined to institutions. It was a living, breathing force that thrived in the choices we make every day. It was found in the way we treat each other, in the way we care for our neighbors, and in the way we choose to rise above fear and injustice, no matter the odds. The legacy of Franklin's actions, the lessons learned by Mrs. Thompson, Officer Burnett, and the community of Crescentville, was a lasting one. It was a legacy built on the belief that each individual has the power to change the world, not through grand gestures or heroic deeds, but through the simple, everyday acts of kindness, courage, and justice that make the world a better place. And so, as Franklin continued his morning jogs through Crescentville, he knew that the real change had already taken root. The community was stronger, more compassionate, and more united than it had ever been before. It wasn't the result of any one person's effort, but the collective power of individuals who chose, day after day, to make the world a little better. The lesson was clear: never underestimate the power of one action, no matter how small, to create a lasting change. It was a lesson that Franklin would carry with him for the rest of his life, and one that would continue to inspire generations to come. And so, the ripple effect continued, spreading far beyond the streets of Crescentville, touching hearts and minds wherever people chose to believe in the possibility of a better world.